mode.
Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to the Students for Liberty webinar series. My name is Morgan Walk and I'm on the Executive Board of Students for Liberty. We're honored to have Peter Bonilla, the Associate Director of FIRE's Individual Rights Defense Program, with us here tonight. He's here to talk about box cutters and bureaucrats, or how to keep your free speech wall safe. Before we begin though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the webinar online courses and organization series. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization run by students for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed to serve a previously unfilled niche in our universities, connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, handbooks on running student organizations, tabling kits, leadership training, and an academic journal for liberty and society, as well as our conferences. The SFL webinar online courses and online organization are a great way of giving you access to ideas and mentorship in liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars to put you in touch with top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country, as well as help guide you through planning and organizing campus events. For upcoming events and webinars, please visit our website, studentsforliberty.org. So this week, I bring to you Peter Bonilla, the Associate Director of FIRE's Individual Rights Defense Program. He also writes for FIRE's blog, The Torch. Since 2011, he's also been a contributor to the policy commentary website Policy Mike, covering issues in American higher education. Prior to joining FIRE, he was a literary manager of Philadelphia's Interact Theater Company, one of the country's top theaters for development and production of new political and socially themed plays. He's a past recipient of a fellowship in playwriting from Pennsylvania Council on the Arts and has been a contestant on Jeopardy! His undergraduate degree, which is a double major in theater and economics, is from the University of Pennsylvania. Quick note, there'll be about a 10 to 15 minute question and answer at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions into the question box. For those interested, the webinar will be recorded and archived and uploaded onto our website during the next few weeks. We'll be sending you out more detailed information about Students for Liberty and our upcoming webinars in a follow-up email. Without further ado, I present to you Peter Bonilla.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you to everyone out there who is tuning in and joining us for this evening's webinar. My name is Peter Bonilla, and thank you for the very nice introduction that you gave me. Before I go into the topic of tonight's discussion, titled Box Cutters and Bureaucrats, How to Keep Your Free Speech Wall Free, let me give just a little bit of background information on my organization, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We were founded in 1999 by the University of Pennsylvania history professor Alan Charles Kors and the Cambridge, Massachusetts civil liberties attorney Harvey Silverglate, after the two co-authored a book called The Shadow University, in which they documented numerous violations of free speech and other key individual liberties on college campuses throughout the 90s. The response to The Shadow University was so significant, and the outpouring so great from students and faculty around the country who had been through cases and suffered circumstances so similar to what they read in The Shadow University. The outpouring was so significant that Alan and Harvey were motivated to start FIRE, and we are the only organization solely focused on defending the free speech and other individual liberties, specifically of college students and faculty around the country. Since 1999, and going on 14 years now, we have successfully defended hundreds of individual students and faculty who have had their rights violated at their colleges and universities, as well as assisted in dozens of policy reforms, reforming unconstitutional speech codes at colleges around the country on campuses with enrollments totaling into the millions. Without further ado, I'll get into the topic of this evening's discussion about free speech walls, and they may be a somewhat new phenomenon, and they have been largely the work and largely the brainchild of the very good people at Students for Liberty. And a free speech wall is exactly what it sounds like. It is a wall of some kind, and you can see the kind of prototype example from the picture on the current slide. That student groups erect and make really a kind of free-for-all for free speech. Allow students and anyone else passing through to write their thoughts, whatever they be, any comments they like, whether political or apolitical, silly or serious, vulgar or eloquent, as it were. And it stands as a kind of living and evolving monument to the principle of freedom of speech on America's college campuses. That said, while they are frequently very successful and they take a very strong and very principled stand for the principle of freedom of speech, which is, I would say, just about nowhere more important than it is on college campuses. They are frequently met with censorship and vandalism and destruction, and as well as bureaucratic red tape. Miles and miles and hours of meetings and runarounds from college administrations, which is kind of a symptom of the administrative kind of industrial complex that FIRE has been dealing with for years. So what I'm going to talk about this evening, I'm going to give kind of a few famous examples of these free speech wall cases, free speech walls that have run into trouble at the hand of vandals, and I'm going to go from there to talking about free speech walls in the context of university free speech policies and the obligations that universities have to ensure free speech for their students. I'm going to talk as well a little bit about the bureaucratic angle, the kind of other big threats that student groups and coalitions of student groups erecting free speech walls are frequently met with, and then I will give a few practical tips for how students can make an effective free speech wall and how they can best protect themselves throughout the process and ensure that their rights are respected by their university administrations. I'll give, for my first example of a kind of free speech wall that was cut down at the hand of the censors, I'm going to go to what, in my experience, I believe at FIRE, where I have been in one capacity or another since 2008, this was, I believe in my personal experience, my first experience with free speech walls when I learned of this case at Pepperdine University. And you can see from the picture I have here the way it embodies the basic principle of free speech walls. You have a large, numerous large sheets of paper where people can come and write their thoughts throughout the day. A celebration, celebrating free speech and everything, kind of that it stands for on the college campuses. And I don't remember exactly how long it had been up, but in the night one night, a student came through the campus and tore this free speech wall down. And the Pepperdine University Students for Liberty chapter, I believe, rebuilt it, and the exhibit went on, and it was a success. But it was, I think, for me, my first kind of experience with this kind of new, this sort of new brand of censorship of students at the hands of their fellow students. This kind of phenomenon of students taking matters into their own hands and thinking that they have the right to censor the work of their fellow students merely because it might offend them or it might offend other people in the community. This sort of exemplifies what FIRE's president Greg Lukianoff calls unlearning liberty. And in fact, Greg in the last year has just published a book exploring this very thing. So this is the first example, and I'm gonna go through these examples fairly quickly before getting to the main free speech and the main bureaucratic issues before taking questions from folks. The next example that that I'll discuss is I think for many of us, especially for FIRE and for our friends at Students for Liberty, kind of the daddy of them all when it comes to these kinds of violations of free speech. This was a free speech wall done at Sam Houston State University in Texas in the fall of, it was either 2010 or 2011. I'm not remembering immediately. It was the fall of 2011, September 2011, and you can see the anti-Obama quote at the center of this free speech wall. And this speech indeed was at the heart of the censorship that this free speech wall was ultimately met with. But before going into that, I'll go into some of the other choice remarks that could be seen on that wall throughout the day. And I think that the kind of diversity, the multiplicity of viewpoints you get here, political statements, pop cultural statements, personal statements, you know, it really does sort of run the gamut of the things that you see on free speech walls. It really sort of, you know, exemplifies the principle behind the thing. And from that perspective, this free speech wall was a fantastic success. And you know, if you go, you know, going back to the previous slide, you can see where someone has written "fuck Obama," another person has written Bush's name right beneath it. It is, you know, the kind of sometimes vulgar essence of core political expression that you see right there, and pretty common kind of language on college campuses these days, and I would say also far more civilized than much of what you'll see on your average comment board on any news site these days. But getting back to the controversy that this wall found itself in, was that a professor at Sam Houston State University, when he was walking through the campus and walked past this free speech wall, saw the anti-Obama quote and was angered by it, and discussed this with the organizers of the free speech wall at SHSU. And the organizers told the professor that this was an act of core protected political expression like any other, and that it was their free speech wall, and that it was clearly speech protected by the First Amendment. And this professor was not satisfied by this explanation. So what the professor did was he went back to his office and he brought back a box cutter, and he literally cut out of that portion of the free speech wall the offending word that had been in front of President Obama's name, took a box cutter, hence the title of this webinar topic for the evening, brought a box cutter from his office, literally cut out the single offending word that he couldn't tolerate, and walked away. And what happened next was that these students called the Sam Houston State Police Department to complain about the vandalism that their wall had suffered at the hands of this professor, that had very publicly suffered at the hands of this professor. And the Sam Houston State Police said, okay, and they went and they interviewed this professor, a professor in the mathematics department at Sam Houston State named Joe Kirk. And what happened next was that the police, instead of defending the free speech rights of the students who had put together this free speech wall, instead came back and told them that rather than protecting their right to freedom of speech and citing the professor for the vandalism of the wall, the students were instead told that the offending language on the wall could constitute a kind of disorderly conduct and be considered a misdemeanor crime, and they were given the option of either removing all offensive language from their free speech wall or facing possible arrest. And the students opted not to self-censor, not to take out any offensive language from their free speech wall, and instead packed up and took the wall down and went home. And in the days after, with some help from fire as well as from the people at Students for Liberty, this incident made significant national attention, was widely publicized. Numerous people wrote into the Sam Houston State Administration criticizing their censorship, and I think ultimately, though the show didn't go on in this case, the Sam Houston State ultimately, I think, recognized the error in how its police department had acted, and hopefully such a thing won't happen again at Sam Houston State. I will give one more kind of egregious censorship example. One more of these kinds of censorship examples, and it has to come with a little bit of a grain of salt, because it takes place at Carleton University, which is in Canada. And the reason I say that it has to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt is that, as we at FIRE are very aware, and probably the people with the Canadian Students for Liberty group that organized this free speech wall, is that free speech protections are much worse in Canada than they are in the United States, and there is much more sympathy there for the idea that that offensive speech that is hurtful to students, can be censored, and in fact, up there believe that there is a kind of moral obligation on some level that such speech should be censored, which is, the antithesis of American free speech traditions. But that is an entirely other, that's a topic for an entire other conversation that maybe one day we can get our friends from Canadian Students for Liberty in on. But this, despite the geographical differences, the circumstances of the censorship of this wall were, I think, pretty similar to some of the other ones that we've seen, like we saw at Pepperdine, which I highlighted earlier. A student named Arun Smith, and I'm not going to bother reading the text off this slide because it's a lot of nonsense when it comes to the idea of defending free speech. But this student took it upon himself to rip down the Canadian SFL's free speech wall, saying that it was offensive that that the SFL group up there had put up its free speech wall at the same time that Gay Pride Week was going on at this campus. And his argument essentially, and after he tore down this free speech wall, he posted a very kind of long, rambling manifesto type statement on his Facebook page, to the extent where his point ultimately was that so long as there is an unfettered right of free speech for those who might hurt or offend us, so long as that kind of speech is allowed to be out in the marketplace, the rest of us, especially the minorities, the oppressed, can't be truly free. So there is a moral obligation that we should take away the free speech rights of those people so that the rest of us can be less oppressed. And that's where that's where I will end with that kind of statement. We can go, I can go on and on and on and on and on about the wrongness of that statement, but I want to go a little bit more into the main issues of free speech and college speech policies. Although I will point out that despite this student's demonstrated lack of respect for the free speech rights of his fellow students, he was, I do note, a human rights major, which cannot be that meaningful of a major in Canada when one thinks of freedom of speech in context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it appears in the preamble as one of the most kind of hallowed principles of global human rights, not even 100 words in. So I always enjoyed that fact about this case. One of the many ironies of this student's sort of, in his own mind, noble attempt at censoring the speech of his fellow students. Now, with those kind of exceptional examples in mind, as a sort of example of, as sort of examples of the occasional controversy that, pardon me, that greets these free speech walls. Pardon me. I want to talk just a little bit about speech codes at college campuses. And this is something that for every organizer of a free speech wall at any campus around the country is something that we encourage them to be very mindful of. And I will go a little bit into the system by which FIRE rates speech codes at campuses around the country. You see the title of this slide, "What Color is Your School?" And for those who may not be familiar with that color system, let me talk just a little bit about the way that FIRE rates speech policies at campuses around the country. As is suggested by the three traffic lights I have on this slide here, we have a three-tiered rating system where we rate schools on the basis of their policies and their commitments to free speech as either red light, yellow light, or green light schools. A red light school is, as some of you have probably surmised, the worst rating that a school can get. And a red light school in this case means that in the case of a public university, it has policies, at least one policy on its book that clearly and substantially on its face violates the First Amendment rights of students, so that as written, it is necessarily an unconstitutional policy. Or in the case of private universities, as written, it clearly contradicts and clearly infringes on their own promises of free speech, which are made in their policies and their handbooks and their mission statements, and which as private entities, the universities, the Harvards and Yales and whatevers of the world are morally as well as legally bound to honor. The second tier in our spotlight system is yellow light, and this is not as bad as red, not as good as green, obviously. And what it means for a university to receive a yellow light rating from FIRE is that it has policies on its books which aren't necessarily unconstitutional the way that they're written, but which are vague enough and poorly written enough that they could be subject to abuse by administrators, that they could easily be applied unconstitutionally because they don't provide clear enough guidance to administrators as to the constitutional protections that students and faculty have. And then the best rating a university can have is a green light rating. And a green light rating means that a university does not have any policies on its books, which as written in any way improperly infringe on free speech rights. There are unfortunately far too few universities in our system that receive this highest green light rating. In a survey of about 400 universities each year that FIRE surveys on the basis of their speech codes, only a handful, a relative handful, 16 universities currently receive our green light rating, and a little over 60% of the universities, both public and private, that we survey receive a red light rating. And one thing, bringing this point kind of back home, one thing that I always one thing that I always encourage students to do is to get to know their handbooks and get to know the policies that govern them, especially their speech policies. The good news for these students is that even if they are at one of our many red light public universities, is that if they're in a public university, the university is required by law to uphold their First Amendment rights. So no matter what a university's policy says, a university cannot legislate away a student's right to free speech. And in the case of private universities are not obligated, obviously, to uphold the First Amendment, with the exception of private non-religious schools in California, which per a state law known in California and elsewhere as the Leonard Law, requires that these universities in California do have to uphold their students' First Amendment rights. Broadly speaking, though, private universities aren't required to do so. But the good news for students at most of our private universities is that most private universities deliver very strong free speech promises, if not explicit promises that students on their campuses will enjoy the same protections for free speech that they enjoy in society at large. So odds are, if you are putting a free speech wall up on your campus, regardless of where you are, odds are pretty good, on the whole, that you will be at a university that owes you some measure of free speech by its own promises, if not by the Constitution. And that being said, I'll go into kind of the first of the kind of the two major schools of threats that these free speech walls often face, which is the accusation that the contents of the free speech walls are somehow not protected by free speech or are not protected by the First Amendment. In almost all cases, students making those arguments will be completely 100% wrong. And one of the ways that they are wrong the most often when it comes to accusations of speech being unprotected is by calling such speech harassment. In FIRE's experience, and in our years of experience evaluating thousands and thousands of speech codes through the years, unconstitutional harassment policies are probably the most common type of unconstitutional speech code that we see in campus policies throughout the country. As you see from the Supreme Court language that I'm quoting here on this slide, the threshold for student-on-student harassment in the educational setting is very high, and the bar is very clearly set. And it's set appropriately high to create a good dividing line between speech that is protected by the First Amendment and speech that is and conduct that is not protected by the First Amendment, and actually goes so far as to deny someone their federally guaranteed right to be in an educational environment free of harassment. The bar is set very high for harassment by the Supreme Court, and universities very, very often fall far, far short of meeting this standard with their policies. It's been one of the most persistent speech code problems that FIRE has faced throughout the years. And in many cases, harassment policies, either the way that they're written or in the way that they are effectively applied by universities, these policies often have the effect of subjecting someone to punishment for racial harassment or sexual harassment solely because solely because something they have said or something they've written was found offensive or was deemed insensitive or inappropriate by another listener in the community. And very often, those simple incidents of someone exercising his First Amendment right to his own free speech, his or her own free speech, and in the process offending the beliefs of another person, very often that is the only bar that universities feel they need to clear to bring harassment charges against a student. And often, often some of the content of free speech walls, and we've seen this over and over again, often some of the content on free speech walls, if it's deemed politically incorrect or insensitive in one way or another, will be accused of being harassment. And when students make that accusation, it's good for the groups organizing free speech walls to know that almost always these students will be mistaken. Another sort of general category, of speech, which is for the most part a made-up category of speech, is the very pesky and so-called hate speech. And I say so-called, and I put it in quotation marks because, as I think probably a number of people on this webinar have seen, and certainly I've seen it many times, and certainly my friends of Students for Liberty have seen it many times. Many people like to throw up a false dividing wall between free speech and so-called hate speech. And a very common refrain that you hear on college campuses these days is hate speech is not free speech. And as my friend Grumpy Cat, who I've just learned about in the last few days and now use for everything, as he points out, this categorization of speech is almost entirely a fantasy. Just about all hate speech is free speech. And in fact, if you look through, the Supreme Court's most famous rulings affecting free speech, most recently perhaps its ruling in the case in Snyder v. Phelps, where it defended the rights of the notorious Westboro Baptist Church to picket at military funerals. Most of our most stirring First Amendment decisions have not dealt with non-controversial or agreeable speech. It has often dealt with the most anger-inducing, the most kind of loathsome expression that people can imagine. So when someone says this speech, if you're organizing a free speech wall and someone comes up to you and says, that's not free speech, that's hate speech, and you need to take it down, you can give that person a copy of the First Amendment or else a copy of Fire's Guide to Free Speech on campus if you have one, and we're happy to send you as many of them as you like. We make those available free of charge to students. What I think students organizing free speech walls can rest pretty assured of is that there is a very, very high bar to cross before anything you're likely to see on a free speech wall crosses the line from being protected into being unprotected. We've talked about the high bar that is set for harassment and how universities very often fall short of that. Other categories of unprotected speech, which I won't go into in detail here, but other categories of unprotected speech include things like libel and defamation, which has a very high and very clear bar to reach and is very difficult to reach. Other things include threats and intimidation, and threats are another another word that is sort of thrown around by college administrations these days. In that, if something, if a comment or something someone says it has the effect of making someone feel just a little bit uncomfortable, students are often accused of making threats. of unlawfully threatening and intimidating these students. And again, there is a very high bar that needs to be cleared for things like that. It is something that needs to credibly put someone in the fear that that they will be subject, that they are in imminent physical peril. And that's very hard to do with anything you're going to write on a free speech wall. And students can rest assured that in letting their fellow students and other members of the community write to their heart's content on their free speech walls, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for anything to cross the line to the point where it loses the protections of the First Amendment. This is something that is often very muddy on college campuses. This is something that unfortunately is deliberately muddied by bad college speech policies. But the protections of the First Amendment are very clear and very strong, and students can rest assured of that. I'm going to transition from here into the kind of other major category of difficulty that students organizing free speech walls often have, which is that they have to deal with layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy. And why this bureaucracy exists is a subject of enduring fascination at FIRE. It has been well documented throughout the years that the ranks of mid-level administrators in colleges and universities around the country have steadily gone up, even while the number of overall faculty at universities has stagnated, and while the number of full-time tenure-track faculties has crashed through the floor. Along those lines, also, at the same time that college bureaucracies have often become very bloated, they've also become very risk conscious. Many students are subject to a lot of paperwork and a lot of unnecessary bureaucratic requirements, simply so that a university administration can feel like it's covering all its bases. To them, they would much rather inconvenience a great number of people than do something that might stand a small chance of putting one student in some kind of risk. And that is just kind of the risk-averse culture of most college administrations these days. And you can see that, and I wish I'd provided more details of this case here. I urge everyone here to go to the Students for Liberty site and find the write-up of the Students for Liberty group at the University of Texas San Antonio, because it was met with a veritable I'm at a loss for words for what they dealt with, but a veritable legion of bureaucracy, of bureaucrats, and veritable miles and miles of red tape in organizing its free speech wall event. Among the challenges that they got from the administration was having their emails go unanswered for weeks at a time, causing them to have to reschedule and push back their planned free speech wall event. A requirement that they undergo a risk assessment so that the university can do a kind of cost-benefit analysis on just how risky it is to allow students to have a free speech wall on the campus. Even though it was unnecessary to do so, the group, of its own accord, modified its design to make it kind of extra foolproof and extra safe after the university raised concerns that it would fall over or that it might blow over. The students modified their design, fortified it, made it extra strong, essentially foolproofed the design, and then was told by the university that that it was good but not good enough, and that it had to be able to withstand, and I'm quoting the university here, hurricane force winds if they were going to be allowed to erect this free speech wall outside. And the group, even after producing a video showing the strength of their free speech wall, demonstrating how unlikely it was to blow over or fall over even if there was a hurricane that came through the San Antonio campus. Even after doing this, the university was unpersuaded, and ultimately, though the group did successfully have its free speech wall, that it did go off well, it was a success, they had to have it inside in a relatively less trafficked area of the campus. And in spite of all those factors, it was considered a success. And the three kind of bullet points that I have up here, this is taken from SFL's blog about the free speech wall at UT-San Antonio, and they really are they really do constitute good advice. And I'll go through them one by one, and then add a few more points of my own before going to the question and answer portion of this. First of all, as their case illustrated, you want to plan this with as much time to spare as you can. Bureaucracy is not often quick. It's very often designed to be slow. And if you want to do something like this, something that takes a fair amount of planning and effort, be sure that you give yourself that amount of time to get it done. Because negotiations can take a while. It can take a while to get all of your paperwork processed. And universities are much more likely to be helpful if you give them a lot of time to work with you than if you go to them and say, we need this done in 24 hours, 48 hours. So give yourself a lot of time. Give yourself time for your event to be successful. Another point, it's kind of a common sense point, but it is a good point, and it is something that that I advise students on very often as well. Be nice to the bureaucrats. Even though they can make your life difficult, they mean well very often, and it will always in the end make your life easier if you show the people that you depend on for approval of your events, for your paperwork to go through, that you want to work with them. If you are nice and pleasant to them and your talks are cordial, they may very well be more inclined to be more helpful to you than a group or a student who is rude or overly demanding. It's a common sense point, but it's one that is very easy to overlook, especially in the frequently maddening world of mid-level bureaucracy that student groups find themselves running into more and more. And lastly, as kind of suggested by the first 2 points, is to persevere. It isn't always easy, and there is often quite a lot of paperwork involved. But as they say, and as their experience made clear, it's worth it in the end if you're doing it for something that you believe in. I'm gonna, along these same lines, I want to just put out here a few practical concerns, things that frequently come up for students who are organizing free speech wall events, and hopefully I am for my SFL organizers. I'm only in my last 5 or so minutes here, which should leave us time for question and answers. But things that you want to consider, and things that you want to have a clear answer on when you go in for that first meeting with the person overseeing your event. The basic dimensions, basic specs of your free speech wall. You know, how large will it be? Where would you like to put it? What kind of assembly will it require? Some universities, not all, but some, have specific policies governing the right of students to construct large displays. Find out if your university has policies like that and how you can work with them on that. Other things like if your university has policies on things like the use of adhesives. The example I talked about a little while back at Pepperdine University, as you may have saw, that involved large pieces of paper taped on a university wall. In Pepperdine's case, they allowed the students to do that. Not all universities do. Many maintain content-neutral policies that just say you can't tape things to these university buildings, and that's generally okay for universities to do. So that is something as well that students want to think about. Free speech walls, they need to have a certain size and a certain dimension to them to be impressive and to get the attention of people passing through the campus. But at some point, you also do need to be mindful about the space that you take up. And you especially want to be mindful of any possibility that your free speech wall, that your design may interfere with the flow of traffic through the campus, or it may be too close to entryways and exits to university buildings. And those are things that universities do have a legitimate interest in controlling and governing, provided that they do so in a content-neutral way. Lastly, for groups' own protections, it's worth it for them to be able to man their free speech walls at all times. We've seen them in a number of different ways. Some of them have to be taken down at the end of every day. Some of them are allowed to stay up overnight, and if it's up overnight, that can be, that's a little bit of a different story in terms of manning the wall. But so that they can, if nothing else, protect it from people who might otherwise vandalize it, or from administrators who might look for a technicality that would let them take down the wall, claiming a policy violation. Be prepared to be by your wall. And lastly, a few final tips, and then we can go into the question and answer. A few more general things that I advise students in general, and I think they will be helpful to anyone who is putting together or thinking of putting together a free speech wall. It's useful for students, especially because putting something like this together, getting it from planning to execution often takes several conversations over a period of weeks sometimes. You want to make sure that all of your discussions with the university are documented, and when possible, make sure that you have your conversations over email and not in person. When you have a conversation via email, you have an instant record of it. You aren't liable to forget key details, and crucial facts aren't going to come down to a matter of he said, she said, when you don't have an exact record of the conversation that you had. If you have an in-person conversation, it's always worth it to follow up with the administrator after to confirm the details of your conversation and create a document that way. I have on here, be willing to be innovative. And that is kind of a catch-all for student groups, being able to think outside the box. Sometimes they need to. In the case of the students at UT-San Antonio doing their free speech wall, as I talked about, in their frustration over the kind of intransigence and the excessive risk consciousness of the UTSA administration, decided to put together a prototype of their wall and make a video of it that they could show to the administration to make their case. Being willing to go the extra mile in circumstances like that can be greatly helpful to you, and it shows the university how much you care about your wall and for the principles behind it. And that is something that impresses them very often. With the wall itself, I mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of being able to man your free speech wall, but to the extent possible, record the activities at the wall during the day. Take lots of pictures, and if there are any incidents, be be ready to make a video or audio recording of those incidents for your reference later. If you're having a dispute with an administrator over some technical detail, or else if a student comes and vandalizes your wall, or a professor comes and vandalizes your wall, be ready to make a recording of that. Fortunately, things like that are easier now than they've ever been, because pretty much most people that you know are carrying around with them a smartphone that allows them to do just that. Don't be afraid to go to the top, as I have written here. Very often you find yourself dealing with mid-level administrators who don't always know exactly what they're doing, and don't always have the clearest handle on your rights in these situations. It never hurts to go to their boss or to their boss's boss. It's something that students at my advice do very frequently and very effectively. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, it always helps to know your handbook and know your policies back to front, and to know exactly the policies governing your activity. Be mindful of demands that on the surface to you seem outrageous. One of the things that I'm remembering the UT-San Antonio administration had the Students for Liberty group there do was that they wanted the group to purchase at great expense a very hefty insurance policy should anything happen with their free speech wall. Be mindful of things like that. Very often things like that have the effect of discriminating against certain groups and certain viewpoints. To that effect, along those same lines, be on the lookout for possible double standards that negatively affect your group. If a university is making one group jump through all of these hurdles and pay all these fees and taking all this time for a group to have a free speech wall, but is letting another group sail on through with its own similar exhibit, that is something that students groups want to be able to document, because it builds a very strong moral case that they are being discriminated against on the basis of their viewpoint or the content of the speech in their activities. And lastly, this is more of a moral point and less of a practical point. When possible, it always helps to have a coalition of groups with you if you want to do this particular kind of activity. The bigger the coalition that you can put together, and in the case of of the group at Sam Houston State University, who I discussed a little while ago, that free speech wall was put together by a coalition of 4 politically very different groups: the Sam Houston State Lovers of Liberty, the Bearcat Democrats, the Sam Houston Democratic Socialists, and the Sam Houston State College Republicans. 4 very politically diverse groups, but all banding together for the common cause of free speech. It sends a powerful message, and it's something that is a great conversation starter. If you're able to get these groups around the table on a principle like this, there's no saying what else you can work with your fellow students are, and you can build your relationships from there. Though I've talked for a little bit too long now, and I'm eager to take a few questions, so I will end that portion of the speech and hand things back over to the organizers and start taking questions. Thank you all very much for tuning in and listening.
All right. So who's got questions? Actually, I have a question. I'm going to quickly play devil's advocate. Sorry, but so what would this constitute as harassment if someone was, say, writing things on the wall like, Susie's terrible. She does it with dogs. She's a horrible person. I mean, that seems pretty close to harassment. What's your response?
It depends on the particular case. in some, in some of those cases, it's obviously very, going to be very unpleasant for the person on the other end. But there's a line to be drawn between what's obviously hyperbole and what might be more properly understood as, if not harassment, then something closer to libel or defamation. You know, if there's if I'm walking past a free speech wall that has a line about me saying, I like to do it with goats, that is, I would find that stupid and ugly and probably hurtful. But I wouldn't necessarily worry so much about people taking that at face value and walking past a free speech wall with that on it, and saying, well, I didn't think I thought I knew him then, but now I know he has this thing for goats. If on the other hand, another example is a line about this person, say this person sexually assaulted this person on X night, and it's not true. Then I think you're much closer to something that that lacks those key First Amendment protections. And I'll give everyone the grain of salt by saying that I'm not an attorney and I'm not a First Amendment lawyer. But I think in cases like that, you are much closer to the line when something like that can be taken, can be taken as a factual statement by people, and it can do a lot of damage to a person's reputation and character. So there is a line. It's sometimes difficult to see, but the line is definitely there.
Hello, can people hear me? Sorry,
Yep,
connection kind of freaked out. Okay, so we've got some questions.
Hello? Do I still have you?
Just
I don't know about the other people here, but that I'm having trouble hearing the question. The connection there is a little bit glitchy.
Hi. Okay, I'll reread.
That's much better.
I'll reread the question. So does FIRE have a way to address administrators' concerns about vulgar language?
Well, the way that we address administrators' concerns about vulgar language, we have a number of different ways. In the case of a public university, or for that matter, most private universities, language being vulgar doesn't in itself make it something that isn't free speech. There are, like I was saying earlier, a lot of our most kind of famed First Amendment opinions from the Supreme Court are things that involve are in cases that that many people would consider involving vulgar language, or even much worse than vulgar language. There are a lot of tools that universities have at their disposal to encourage better dialogue and more civility in student interactions, and civility is something that is very much as a concept on the mind of college administrations these days. But they have a lot of, there's a lot that they can do to encourage what they might see as better dialogue, but that does not mean that they can that they can punish speech that is protected by the First Amendment simply because others in the community might find it crass.
Okay, so we have one more question from Connor Roth from Notre Dame. So his question is, he goes to Notre Dame, which has a red light based on fire standards. I checked it out today, and this rating is due to Notre Dame's policy against obscene/pornographic material. Have you talked to other schools with other restrictions on speech like this? I've been curious, thinking about if there's anything we could do to help remedy this. The issue is, since the obscene material is against the doctrine of the Catholic Church, I don't think the school will change its policies.
That's a very good question. And what I'm going to do for Connor, I would be very interested. What I wish I had in front of me right now was a copy of Notre Dame's speech policies, because I'd very much like to be able to give it a look so that I can sort of eyeball and tell him precisely what it is about that policy that earns it a red light rating from fire. Obscenity is one of those forms of unprotected speech that has another clear legal definition and has been ruled on by the Supreme Court. Not having Notre Dame's policy in front of me and not having the specific language, if that policy gets a red light rating from fire, my guess is that it would be that in addition to unprotected obscene materials, it also includes things that would be considered protected speech even by Notre Dame's statements as a Catholic institution. It's pretty common for it's common and understandable for religious institutions of higher education to incorporate their church's teachings and their church's beliefs on certain things into their policies. But many of these universities, Notre Dame is one, places like Georgetown University in D.C. are another, that in spite of their religious mission and their religious background, do still make promises of free speech to their students in spite of their religious identity. So my guess, not having the language of the policy in front of me, would be that that this Notre Dame policy is not written carefully enough to separate what speech is clearly protected by its own policies from other speech that would not be protected. So for Connor, if you're interested, you see on the slide my email address, peter@thefire.org. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to start up a conversation with you about that, and I'm happy to put you in touch with the attorneys at Fire who evaluate speech codes, and they'd be more than happy to give you an explanation of why they're rated the way that they are. And if you're interested in working to reform Notre Dame's speech policies, we're very happy to see if we can work with you and work with the Notre Dame administration to make them better.
All right, well, I guess we'll wrap this up. Thank you so much to Peter and all our participants this evening. I hope you all continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. On a final note, you'll be shortly receiving a follow-up email where you'll find more detailed information about SFL in our next webinars. You'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve our programs and make the webinars more interesting for you. And with that, we're done. Thank you again for your time this evening, and have a great night.
And thank you all for listening.